out the dates and times. And you'll hear about that from various forensic experts, as well as stipulations, agreements between a condition of his plea agreement. And there's also going to be a written document that you'll see that his lawyer signs, he signs, the district attorney signs, says all of these things that I'm telling you. And that ultimately, if he were to get up on the stand and, let's say, lie and come up with some story that the court determined to be untruthful, we could then ask to be relieved of this plea bargain, and then he would go to trial for first-degree murder, conspiracy, use of a knife. And you'll hear, again, that is up to the court, not the district attorney's office. You're going to hear that the defendant made several calls the night of the murder regarding the victim's murder to his family. You're going to hear that during these conversations, starting that night, she starts bringing up the victim's life insurance policy. You're going to hear she called Fabio's family in Toronto, including his son Luigi, who's going to come to testify. She told him through a friend, Deborah Obad, who was at the house at the time that she was making the calls, that he didn't have to worry because Fabio had a hefty life insurance policy and he would be taken care of. You're also going to hear that Fabio had a significant life insurance policy, as I mentioned, also stock options and other assets, and that the defendant was one of the main beneficiaries to these policies and assets. Executives from Fabio's company, Wella, found out about the murder, came to see the defendant that night after learning of Fabio's murder, and the defendant began immediately to question them about Fabio's insurance policy and issues relating to money. You're going to hear that she began harassing and pestering multiple people about Fabio's insurance policy proceeds, and that it began that night, went on over the days, weeks, and months that followed until the date of her eventual arrest. Because the LAPD never cleared her, MetLife, who were the life insurance policy holder, refused to pay out defendant's portion of the insurance policy proceeds. They paid out the portions to the children, but as you are going to hear, it didn't really matter how many people she harassed, pestered, or even threatened, that at the end of the day, in a case like this where it's obvious someone is murdered, life insurance companies do not pay out until law enforcement tells them that the beneficiaries have been cleared. And the defendant was never cleared because the LAPD, at this point in time, it was Valley Bureau homicide detectives, Verna and Parshall, and you'll hear from Detective Verna, based on their investigation, did not clear her. So I'm going to turn to this part of the case now. As I said, the defendant became fixated with the life insurance payout beginning the night of the murder of her husband. She started conversations with Wella executives, Sal Macheri, the CEO, who's going to fly in and testify, Dave Diaz, another one of the vice presidents of the company. I think Bob Lucian was there that night, and Henry Meyer, who was the senior HR director, who would have been responsible for assisting the Sementilli family with whatever policies Fabio had through the company. You're going to hear that the executives agreed to pay the defendant Fabio's salary for 6 months. They came up with that policy just because of how important the Sementillis and Fabio was to the company. And so they told her not to worry about it. They were going to pay her for 6 months. And you're going to hear she asked about that again the next day. You're going to hear that unlike some companies, Wella not only paid for Fabio's salary for 6 months, they paid for a memorial, They paid for a wake that was held in the Sementilli backyard that was catered. They also paid to expatriate or transport his body back home to Canada for burial. You're going to hear about the defendant's pressure campaign to try and speed up the life insurance payouts from multiple witnesses, including Henry Meyer, including Janet Cover, who worked for HR with Henry, and Tracy Rakovich, who was the senior benefits manager for Cody Incorporated, which also included Wella out of their New York office. You're going to hear that the defendant complained on a regular basis to Detective Parshall, Detective Verna, and their partner, Detective Steve Castro, about why law enforcement was taking so long in their investigation to come up with a suspect and to clear her. You're going to hear that she complained to all of Fabio's colleagues and friends and to anyone who would listen that she had no money and was desperately in need of Fabio's life insurance proceeds in order. So as you can see here from this text message string, the defendant's friend, Deborah Obad, began messaging the CEO, Sal Macheri, the night of the murder at about 11:30 and throughout the next day multiple times, stating that the defendant wants to know about the insurance money. You're going to hear from Sal Macheri that he thought that at this particular time that wasn't anybody's main concern, given that Fabio had just been brutally murdered at his home. He explained to Deborah Obad that Henry Meyer, the director of HR, was the person to contact. He's, again, the CEO. You're going to hear that he showed these text messages to Dave Diaz and Henry Meyer because he found them so inappropriate and given the timing. But again, this was the beginning, and you can see here on the left, Deborah Obad is texting Sal Macheri that Monica is asking about the life insurance. Can you figure this out? You're going to hear more about the defendant's close friend, Deborah Obad, later, and the part that she played in some of the investigation. You're also going to hear, as I said, from several of Fabio's colleagues at Wella and in various capacities, and at a trendsetter trip. I told you about the trendsetter trip that they got to go on every year because of their successes for the company. 2 years prior to the murder, maybe a little less, maybe about a year and a half, the defendant told the regional education manager that Fabio was worth more dead to her than alive. And needless to say, this was something Mr. Pulera never forgot, and you will hear from him when he flies out. So, you're going to hear that the defendant stands to inherit over $2 million in this case, $2.2 million, if she's acquitted of the charges, if she's acquitted of Fabio's murder. You're going to hear from an expert in family law and marital dissolution, Marie Ebersbacher. She's an independent expert that the district attorney's office hired that will talk to you about the various assets. We'll talk about the total amount of inheritance at issue here, just the defendant's portion, $2.2 million, including life insurance and other assets. And because she's also an expert a forensic expert in family law and marital dissolution, she's going to also testify that this amount is 1 $2.5 million more than the defendant would have gotten had she divorced Fabio. So what the defendant said to Sam Pulera back in 2015, that Fabio was worth more dead than alive, she certainly knew what she was talking about. You're going to hear that the defendant was interviewed, as you can imagine, by law enforcement multiple times, by the LAPD. And you could also imagine that someone who had their spouse murdered would be willing to talk to law enforcement and provide every scintilla of information they could to make sure that the person that they were married to for almost 20 years, who they claimed to have loved, who they shared a home with for almost 20 years, who they had children with, would be nothing if not completely truthful and cooperative with law enforcement, because you could imagine that your main focus would be to assist law enforcement so that they can apprehend somebody who brutally murdered your spouse at your home. That's not what happened here. You're going to hear that the defendant lied over and over and over again to law enforcement. As I told you, initially this case was being handled by the Valley Bureau Homicide Division, Detectives Ryan Verna and Jean Parchal and their unit. And when they interviewed her, she claimed she didn't even think Fabio had life insurance or know anything about the policy. And this was something that she said on the night of the murder when she was first interviewed. But in reality, what you're going to see is that she knew all about Fabio's life insurance policy. I already told you she was the one that handled the family finances. But what you see here is an email that Fabio sent to the defendant with his 2017 benefit and life insurance policy selections. And this occurred on October 4th of 2016. He specifically sent the defendant an email with screenshots of those benefit elections and his life insurance policy, indicating 2 times his salary. And you can imagine this is just a piece of the email, but you can see it comes from Fabio. Wella's now been bought out by Cody, and he sends it to the defendant. Actually, it should say Monica Sementilli at the top, and it's her email, calmatimo@hotmail.com. Henry Meyer, the HR director at Cody, gave the defendant several documents. These are a couple of them that you see here, showing Fabio's estimated disbursements for his beneficiaries, because Fabio made elections as to how much he wanted to go to each child and how much he wanted to go to Monica. And the documentation that Henry Meyer provided didn't even contain all of the life insurance and other benefits that Fabio had signed up with. You're also going to hear from Janet Cover, who worked under Henry Meyer in the HR division at Cody, that the defendant requested that she come to the Sementilli home and make calls with her. And you're going to hear that Janet Cover went to the Sementilli home, made various calls at the defendant's request to the insurance companies, and that occurred in February of 2017. Remember, Fabio's murdered January 23rd. Throughout the next several months, the defendant claimed that she urgently needed money, although, again, as you'll hear, she was still getting Fabio's salary. She called HR at Wella every couple of days regarding this urgency that she needed for money. And she also expressed this urgency to the LAPD You're going to hear at some point, although Henry Meyer was the one who put into policy for Wella and Cody going forward, when an employee of the company dies in this manner, that the company's going to pay them salary for 6 months, which is also something that would be unheard of. That was something Henry Meyer came up with and pushed through as policy with Sal Macheri. And you're going to hear that the defendant complained about him, that he wasn't trying to speed up the payment quick enough, and so she eventually had a lawyer start calling him about the money. And as I told you before, Henry Meyer, this wasn't something he could do anything about. On February 14th of 2017, the defendant received a response from P&G regarding a breakdown showing that Fabio had approximately $230,000 just in stock options. And this was found in her email account. The defendant sent portions of this chart that you see here to Luigi, Fabio's son, and when Luigi flew into town with the rest of the family, she printed out a copy on her computer, which was in the upstairs office area in the house, immediately after his father's murder, showing him the breakdown of Fabio's life insurance and other benefits and the portion that would be coming to him. As I mentioned, the defendant called the LAPD homicide detectives, Verna and Parshall, the initial investigating officers on this case, repeatedly on each of these dates, trying to get information to stay ahead of their investigation, to throw them off track, to keep her co-conspirator Robert Baker informed of their progress. And she constantly asked about whether they had any DNA results. You're going to hear that detectives, because they were investigating her and knew about her relationship with Baker, when every time she would call, they would record the conversation. So you don't have to take my word for it. All of these were recorded, and you will hear those conversations and those calls that she made to the LAPD on each of these dates, including all of the things I just mentioned. And that despite the fact that they were in the middle of an investigation, homicide detectives aren't going to give up the information in their investigation. That's not what they're trained to do. They're not going to do anything that potentially could hamper or impede their investigation. On March 9th, the defendant called P&G and a Canadian insurance company, Morneau Chappelle, to try and acquire Fabio's life insurance. She expressed her frustration with them, claimed she didn't know what was going on, although you'll hear that she was advised of the process by LAPD numerous times, and the